Today's episode is in part brought to you by Brilliant. Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of Rapid Fire Reading Tips. And today we're going to talk about something that a lot of people don't really want to talk about, which is academic reading. This video's objective is to equip you with the skills that you need to read academic texts proficiently. And I think more important than just being able to read these texts is to remove the fear that you have for these texts. 3 points of housekeeping first before we get into the actual reading tip or the reading system. Housekeeping number 1. As a student in the humanities, I don't care if you're in history or in literature or in anthropology, and especially in philosophy or something like literary theory, you can't escape academic reading. Some students, especially in literature, because they weren't trained to read these kinds of texts, they really struggle with theory. And by the time they get to a third year or fourth year level, that lack of theoretical grounding or the knowledge in the academic debates or scholarly debates, it really holds them back from crafting the arguments that they want to craft. So even though skills like close reading or textual analysis or all those skills are really good and all, but if you don't have the ability to deal with secondary readings and especially papers on the recent academic debates on a certain topic, it's going to severely limit your range of arguments when it comes down to crafting your own response to the text or crafting a final paper or crafting a research project. But for the time being, would you rather be the person who confronts ththese challenges head on, or would you be that one person who relies on summary notes? So I think, at least for me, I want to confront a challenge head on. And if you are also that type of person, here's housekeeping point number 2. In a lot of academic writings, most of the time, it's not exactly a question about content, because the content can be summarized in an abstract paragraph, but most of the time it's about the style of communication, especially in fields that are kind of softer in the humanities, for example, literature, literary theory, and philosophy. Words are all we have to communicate these insights, unlike anthropology or more empirical sciences. They have data and figures and graphs to communicate their insights. And if the only thing that you have are words, then academics really have to tread this thin line between accessibility, clarity, and technical understanding. And if you've ever tried to write an academic paper yourself, if you ever try to conjure up one of these final papers, then you're going to quickly find out that it's actually incredibly difficult to both engage your readers with clarity and simplicity, and at the same time still hit all these technical points that you're supposed to hit. This is the task, and unfortunately, a lot of academics are so overworked that clarity isn't exactly prized as much as technical understanding, resulting in this great volume of amazing insights, frankly, but a lot of us just don't have the tools to access them. And in my experience, after reading thousands of pages of this kind of stuff, well, actually, a lot of the theory that you're going to find in philosophy, in literary theory, or many other fields out there, the core principle is actually quite simple. Or what the academic's trying to get into your head, that point is usually quite simple, but then in order to properly articulate this deceptively simplistic point, they have to rely on all these rhetorical devices to convince you that this theory is important. And all these branches, sub-branches of articulation, that's the style of the communication that you need to get through to get to the core of the author's argument. Sometimes it's super easy to get caught up in definitions and qualifiers and this or that without really getting to the core of the author's argument. So the tips that I'm going to give you a little bit later are going to help you to get through this thick web of references and jargon. And finally, housekeeping point number 3, it's all a matter of practice. When you first engage with your first academic paper in your first year, you're going to hate it. Of course you're going to hate it, because you're essentially engaging with a web of knowledge that you do not have. You don't understand the in-jokes, you don't understand this allusion here, you don't really understand that reference there. The more you practice, the more this impenetrable wall of text is going to read like normal text. The more you're going to gain a sense of clarity. You know what to look for. You know what to push aside for the time being for the sake of getting to the author's central argument. And do keep in mind that all the tips that I'm going to give you in the next section of this video are going to be guardrails. They're going to be scaffolds, because one day you're going to train up your reading abilities enough so that you don't really need these guardrails. You can just read it straight away. You know what to do. You know how to find a core message of the text, and at that point, you can archive this video, you can give it a dislike, whatever you want to do with it, but nevertheless, now let's get into the tips for how to get through an academic paper. Now, you've probably already heard of this method of reading called SQ3R, but I think a lot of people get caught up in the definitions of like what to do in these steps, and they turn this method of reviewing and recalling into a methodology in itself, and it gets really complicated real quick. So today we're going to address this reading method in the most most bare bones manner possible to get you reading as soon as possible instead of getting into the definitions of how to do this right, how to do that right. The first letter S means surveying the chapter. If you've watched my previous video on how to get the most out of a nonfiction book, this first survey stage is basically an inspectional overview of the paper. The surveying stage basically means you want to read through this paper as fast as possible, pay attention to major bold headings, pay attention to the abstract, pay attention to the conclusion, pay attention to the methodology, and the core findings of this academic paper. Do not spend more than 10 minutes on this. The point here is to have enough information about the text to bring you to step number 2, which is questioning. You know that weird thing that we always do? If I buy a book from a bookshop and all of a sudden I notice everyone around me reading that book, or if I buy a red car, all of a sudden I'm noticing all the red cars around me. Human beings are geared to look for questions to answers. And this is the key to turn you from a passive reader to an active reader, which is to conjure up questions that you want to ask about the text. More often than not, one single reading of an academic paper is not sufficient for you to get all the answers that you want from the text. So it's really important for us to lay out these questions explicitly so we can engage that area of our brains that can seek out solutions for these questions that we've listed. Ask questions such as, what is the main contention of the piece? How do I compare this area of understanding to my previous understanding? What did the author mean by this or that? And just basically get as specific as possible and give yourself some space to come up with 5 or 6 really good questions that you want to ask this academic paper. And now we can move on to R1, which is read. This is the time where you have to engage with the text intensively. Given that now you have this list of extensive questions that you want to ask the text, right now you have to pull out a pencil, circle key definitions, scribble stuff down in the margins, and basically engage in a very intense dialogue based on a question that you've gathered from a previous stage. And this is the step where you don't want to save time, because if you skip a few stages, you're going to have to go back and read the whole thing again, because your understanding is not going to be as rigorous, you won't get as much out of it. And once you've done a deep reading of the entire piece, now you can move on to the second R, which is recall. And now this is the stage where you put the academic paper away. Now you're on your own. You can create some summary points, but most importantly, review the questions that you've gathered and ask yourself, did I resolve all these questions that I wanted to ask the text? Did the author supply sufficient evidence for this point that I wanted to ask? Do I have certain remaining queries or confusion? And do I have to go back to the text again to find the answers to some of these queries and confusion? And the last stage here is review. And you can experiment with the duration, but very recommended you to do it a day after you've read the paper so you can test your recall. Ask yourself key questions like, what have I gathered from this paper? What are the key concepts covered in this paper? Did the author sufficiently argue their point? But last but not least, how can I use this new understanding to formulate one of my own arguments? And throughout this process, you want to resist the urge to go back to the paper because you're actually training yourself to actively recall some of the stuff that you've learned. But in case you still find points of confusion and things that you didn't understand, go back to the survey stage and reread the thing again with a pencil, and gradually you can cover all the gaps in your knowledge as you rinse and repeat throughout this whole process of SQ3R. So in summary, first of all, survey the entire paper. Make sure that you have certain questions to ask this paper. Explicitly lay out all these questions to you so you know what to look for when you're reading it deeply. Read it deeply, close the book, force yourself to recall something, and last but not least, review all the steps above to see where your gaps of knowledge are. And if you consistently apply these steps to your academic reading, after a few months or even a year, you're going to get better at it. And I think, like I said before, these steps are merely scaffolds for you to build on. They're merely guardrails that you can take off once you're comfortable enough with the form. And in fact, nowadays, I don't really find myself following every single step of this method because over time, you do tend to develop an eye for certain things. And this eye is going to allow you to basically read something once and get a really good sense of understanding out of it. And that's the value of reading something difficult. It's because it's going to train up your reading muscle, so when you return to something less difficult, you're going to be a better reader. So anyway, I don't want to waste more of your time. Those are the tips for how to read an academic journal. And before I leave you to read an academic paper, here's a quick word for today's video sponsor, Brilliant. If you enjoy my stuff in the sphere of the humanities, then Brilliant is basically the STEM counterpart for these great little lessons to better your understanding. And it is a platform where you learn by doing with thousands of interactive lessons in mathematics, mathematics, data analysis, programming, and artificial intelligence. For me personally, what really turned me off about STEM education, or at least formal STEM education, is the rote learning aspect, where you have to memorize all these laws and figures and formulae. But Brilliant is a place where you learn by doing, where you learn the meaning behind a formula, where you get that deeper understanding of where the formula came from with illustrations and puzzles. And beyond just learning some really niche concept in artificial intelligence or computer programming, you're also going to learn a system of problem solving. And just like how reading an academic paper isn't exactly just about reading the paper, but it's about developing a way of viewing the world, it's about developing problem solving skills, Brilliant is going to give you the same problem solving skills that you can keep for the rest of your life. And alongside the problem solving skills, Brilliant is also going to give you the opportunity to develop your own daily learning routine, which nowadays I think is just a great pastime. I love learning new things. And as someone who's really invested in the future of the humanities and who's really interested in the intersection between technology and the humanities, Brilliant's recent AI workshop on how large language models work is something that I'm currently working through personally. So if you're interested in a hands-on experience with these models, and if you want to understand how computers can generate texts that sound like someone's written them, this entire suite of lessons and content is perfect for you. And as a lucky viewer of this channel, Brilliant is offering a full 30 days free trial. Visit brilliant.org/rcwalden or click the link in the description to get a 20% off on your annual subscription. That is brilliant.org/rcwalden for your discount and your trial. Thank you, Brilliant, for sponsoring today's video, and I hope that you've enjoyed all the tips on how to read an academic journal. Robin Waldun here. Take care, and goodbye.